Hello and welcome to this basics episode on the Mississippi, an in-depth look at locomotives from the early days of steam. Mississippi is one of the most well-known but also least understood of preserved American locomotives. The origin of the locomotive and its subsequent history are obscure and clouded in much myth, including that it was used by both sides during the American Civil War. It isn't certain when Mississippi was built or by whom. One theory suggests it was built as early as 1836 by a small New York firm H.R. Dunham and Company, from components supplied by Braithwaite, Milner and Company of London, or even from Robert Stevenson and Company of Newcastle. But none of this can be substantiated through archival evidence. Certainly the boiler is not of a design used by either Braithwaite & Co. or Stevenson's, and it is absolutely tiny, only 26 inches in diameter, and probably was not originally built as a locomotive boiler, but more on that later. In 2019, the doyen of American railroad historians John H. White Jr. put forward the theory that Mississippi was in fact cobbled together from a second-hand boiler and the wheels, frame, cylinders and so forth from an 1870s 040 shunter, or in American parlance yard switcher, possibly around 1893, the same year as the Columbian Exposition. He suggests that none of it is as old as is traditionally claimed. However, recent and ongoing research is showing that Mississippi was probably built sometime by the 1870s. Despite all the varied and colourful myths, the locomotive's history does not appear with any confidence until the 1880s, and only possibly might it appear in the 1870s. It may have been a locomotive which was unloaded from a steamboat from St. Louis for work on the Mississippi Valley and Ship Island Railroad in 1873, referred to as the Little Engine Hercules. The NV and SI Railroad managed to build 11 miles of track out of Vicksburg, but then ran out of money. Hercules ran on the NV and SI along the Mississippi Valley for some time, sometimes claimed to have run into a ditch, which is probably apocryphal. The line was very poor. The engine is included in a lawsuit against the railroad by a mechanic who was not paid for repairing it. And the entire railroad was subsequently sold at a sheriff's sale in January 1878. James Hoskins probably took over the plant of the NV and SI, as soon after he took on a contract to complete the line as far as the east bank of the Big Black River, with a possible further extension, and we'll hear more about Hoskins later. The locomotive probably had a conventional layout with a cab at the rear, with a regulator in the cab, and possibly had a saddle tank, as evidenced by a redundant bracket on the boiler barrel. Another theory is that it might be an unidentified old locomotive at a Brookhaven, Mississippi foundry and machine shop affiliated with Hoskins in the 1870s, also put up for sale to satisfy debts. It is not known where it went, or if it came back, but Hoskins' shop could easily have put together a locomotive from existing components. In the early 1880s, Hoskins and his business partner Jones Hamilton built a small lumber road out of Brookhaven. This is where the Mississippi finally shows up with reasonable certainty in the historic record. They built the road to standard gauge to interchange with the Illinois Central, which had just acquired and re-gauged the 5-foot gauge north-south trunk line through Mississippi. And there is evidence that the Mississippi has been re-gauged by moving the wheels on the axle to accommodate a narrower gauge. It was rebuilt around 1883, which included the provision of a second steam dome midway along the boiler barrel, into which the regulator was moved. A cab was added on top of the boiler, the fireman standing in his usual position, allowing the operator to stand above the engine, presumably to increase all-around visibility when shunting. In this form, the locomotive, by then named Bumblebee, gained the unofficial nickname of Camelback. To provide cheap labour for their operation, Hoskins and Hamilton leased convicts from the state penitentiary. They had a ready supply of such labour, as they also supplied saloons with alcohol, which in turn supplied convictions for drunkenness and therefore supplied convict labour. Sadly, the majority of this cheap labour force used by Hoskins and Hamilton were persons of colour. Hoskins and Hamilton were criticised in the press for working and exploiting this cycle, but were also equally praised for making the system pay. Hoskins later got into financial difficulty whilst building an extension to the Illinois Central, and it's likely that the financial claim could be satisfied in part by providing a suitable historic relic for sale. That relic being the Mississippi. It was probably Hoskins who made the suggestion that his locomotive had worked on the Natchez and Hamburg Railroad after having read a newspaper item describing fond memories of that short-lived early line. Mississippi then began being promoted as a venerable relic in 1893 at the Columbian Exposition of that year. Sadly, Hoskins would die in 1898 in a mental hospital, his mental health having been failing for some time. But to get back to the question of originality, what about the boiler? It is made from very small wrought iron plates with hand-closed rivets, suggesting an early date or homespun construction. The taper between the firebox and the boiler barrel are indicative of a date of construction between the early 1850s and the early 1870s. The unused bracket on the boiler barrel may have supported a saddle tank, or given the very small diameter of the boiler, it was probably once part of a stationary engine. Indeed, one source suggests it came from a gin boiler. The wheels are of a type used by Paterson, New Jersey builders Rogers or Danforth Cook, and also agree with the date between 1850 and the early 1870s. The valve gear is Stevenson Link, dating from the same 1850s to 1870s period. The working pressure of the boiler is an incredible 150 psi, again arguing for a later rather than earlier date. The cylinders are bolted to the unusually shaped smoke box. There is no smoke box door, instead the entire front is removed. A handle present in the 1890s facilitated this. It's very crude, but perhaps indicative of homespun construction rather than any great antiquity. The use of outside horizontal cylinders would be very unusual in both Europe and in America during the 1830s and 1840s, again arguing for a later date. The form of cylinder and valve chest again suggest a date from the 1850s to the early 1870s, and perhaps a Rogers or Illinois Central influence. The only very old features of the locomotive are the cast iron horn blocks bolted to the bar frame. But if the locomotive was homespun, they could have been reused from an earlier machine or cast locally. The elegant five-sided crosshead guide bar contrasts with the crude construction of the rest of the engine. Its design is so specific and sophisticated that it must have been developed elsewhere, but as yet no matches can be found. Sadly, during a misguided restoration in the 1960s, it lost its 1880s cab and original tender in an attempt to give it a more antique 1840s appearance. So how old is Mississippi? It was probably built sometime before 1873, either by James Hoskins as a homespun machine or for the Mississippi Valley and Ship Island Railroad, where it was named Hercules. It then passed into the ownership of Hoskins, who in the years before his death promoted his ragtag and bobtail machine as a venerable relic. Even if it isn't as old as previously thought, Mississippi is still a unique locomotive with a fascinating story to tell. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please hit like, share and subscribe.